November 1944. A reinforced concrete laboratory buried beneath the hills outside Yokohama. Three of Japan's most brilliant aviation fuel engineers stood before a pristine American aircraft engine, salvaged from a downed fighter in the Philippines and transported across thousands of kilometers of increasingly hostile ocean. Dr. Takeshi Yamamoto, the team leader, had spent 17 years perfecting fuel formulations for the imperial forces. He believed with absolute certainty that Japanese engineering ingenuity could overcome any material disadvantage. After all, Japanese pilots were the best trained in the world. Japanese aircraft designs were elegant and efficient. Whatever secrets the Americans possessed, they could be understood, replicated, and improved upon. That was the promise he had made to the Imperial Army Air Service. That was the confidence he carried into the laboratory that morning. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Dr. Yamamoto and his colleagues would discover over the following weeks would fundamentally transform their understanding of the conflict they were engaged in. They would come to realize that the aerial struggle over the Pacific was not primarily being decided by pilot skill or aircraft design, but by something far more fundamental: the invisible liquid flowing through engine fuel lines. This is the story of how three Japanese engineers confronted an uncomfortable truth about industrial capacity and technological achievement, and what their reactions revealed about the nature of the entire Pacific confrontation. To understand what happened in that Yokohama laboratory, we must first understand the man who led the investigation. Takeshi Yamamoto had graduated top of his class from Tokyo Imperial University in 1927, specializing in petroleum chemistry. He had spent time studying in Germany during the 1930s, learning from the brilliant chemists who had developed synthetic fuel processes. He returned to Japan, convinced that scientific excellence could compensate for resource scarcity. Japan had almost no domestic petroleum production, importing nearly 90% of its oil from abroad before the conflict began. This fundamental vulnerability had shaped Japanese strategic thinking for decades and had been a primary motivation for expansion into resource-rich territories. Yamamoto's team had achieved remarkable results under these constraints. They had developed fuel formulations using domestic resources and synthetic processes that achieved octane ratings of 87 to 91, which they considered quite competitive with what they believed American forces were using. Octane rating measures a fuel's resistance to premature detonation in an engine cylinder. Higher octane fuel allows for higher compression ratios and supercharger boost pressures, which translates directly into more engine power. Every point of octane rating could mean the difference between climbing faster than an enemy or being unable to escape. Working alongside Yamamoto were two other distinguished engineers. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nakamura had spent a decade developing fuel systems for naval aviation and understood the practical challenges of fuel performance in tropical conditions. Dr. Kenji Watanabe was a younger researcher who specialized in the molecular chemistry of hydrocarbon combustion. Together, they represented the finest expertise Japan could assemble for this critical investigation. The American engine before them was a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, an 18-cylinder radial power plant that produced over 2,000 horsepower in its latest variants. It had been carefully removed from the wreckage of a Grumman F-6F Hellcat that had been forced down on a Philippine island. The engine was remarkably intact, and crucially, its fuel tank still contained several hundred liters of American aviation gasoline. Yamamoto's first impression of the engine was one of grudging respect. The manufacturing precision was exceptional, with tolerances that matched or exceeded Japanese standards. The metallurgy appeared excellent, but these were things Japanese industry could potentially replicate given sufficient time and resources. What Yamamoto truly wanted to understand was whether American fuel technology held any significant advantages. The team began by carefully draining the remaining American fuel into sealed containers. The liquid was clear with a slight blue tint, its appearance unremarkable. But when Nakamura brought a sample close to examine it, he noticed something unexpected. "The smell," he said to his colleagues, "it is different from our fuel." There is something else in here. Watanabe nodded in agreement. Multiple aromatic compounds, he observed. The formulation is complex. Yamamoto instructed his team to begin comprehensive chemical analysis. Over the following 3 days, they subjected the American fuel to every test in their laboratory's considerable arsenal. They measured specific gravity, vapor pressure, and distillation curves. They analyzed lead content, sulfur levels, and aromatic hydrocarbon concentrations. They tested for the presence of various additives and blending agents. When the results came back, Yamamoto stared at the figures for a long time without speaking. His colleagues watched him nervously, waiting for his assessment. Finally, he spoke. "Run the tests again." There must be an error. There was no error. The American aviation gasoline had a performance number of 150. Not octane rating, but performance number. A measurement scale used for fuels that exceeded 100 octane and measured the percentage increase in power output compared to pure iso-octane. A performance number of 150 meant the fuel could produce 50% more power than a theoretical perfect 100-octane fuel under the same conditions. Japanese fuel engineers had not believed such a rating was practically achievable. Their best aviation gasoline achieved a performance number of approximately 91 to 95. The gap was not a matter of marginal refinement. It was a chasm. Watanabe was the first to articulate what they were all thinking. If this fuel is representative of what American aircraft are using generally, then our performance calculations for their aircraft have been significantly wrong. Nakamura's face had gone pale. He understood the operational implications immediately. "This explains the climb rates," he said quietly. "This explains the altitude performance. This explains why our pilots report that American aircraft seem to have power reserves that our aircraft lack even at full throttle." Yamamoto held up his hand for silence. He needed to think through the implications carefully before making any official report. The political consequences of these findings could be severe. Senior military officials did not appreciate receiving information that contradicted their assumptions or suggested fundamental strategic problems that could not be easily solved. But the scientist in Yamamoto could not suppress his curiosity about how the Americans had achieved this remarkable formulation. Over the following week, his team conducted detailed compositional analysis, working to reverse engineer the American fuel's chemistry. What they discovered was a feat of industrial chemistry that represented years of systematic research and development. The American fuel used a base stock of carefully refined petroleum with high concentrations of iso-octane and other high-performance hydrocarbon components. But the true innovation lay in the additive package. The fuel contained tetraethyl lead at concentrations significantly higher than Japanese formulations used, boosting anti-knock properties substantially. More impressively, it included aromatic hydrocarbons created through catalytic reforming processes that Japan had not yet mastered. The Americans had also added small amounts of aniline and other compounds that further enhanced performance. Watanabe calculated that producing a single liter of this fuel required industrial processes and raw materials that Japan simply did not possess in adequate quantities. The alkylation units needed to produce high-octane base stocks required specialized catalysts and precise temperature controls. The catalytic reforming required platinum catalysts that Japan could not obtain. The aromatic blending agents required advanced chemical synthesis capabilities. What frustrated Yamamoto most was not that Japanese scientists could not understand the chemistry. They understood it perfectly well. The formulations were not based on scientific principles unknown to Japanese researchers. The gap was not one of knowledge, but of industrial capacity. America had the petroleum reserves, the refinery infrastructure, the chemical plants, the catalyst supplies, and the engineering workforce to produce this fuel in quantities sufficient to supply every aircraft in their inventory. Japan did not. Japan could not. And no amount of pilot training or aircraft design brilliance could overcome that fundamental reality. Nakamura requested permission to conduct operational tests with the captured American fuel in a Japanese aircraft engine. Yamamoto approved, recognizing the value of understanding the practical performance differential. They selected a Nakajima Homar engine, one of Japan's most advanced power plants, which normally produced around 2,000 horsepower on Japanese fuel. The engine was mounted on a test stand with full instrumentation to measure power output, cylinder temperatures, and other performance parameters. First, they established baseline performance using standard Japanese 150-Octane Aviation gasoline. The engine performed to specifications, producing its rated power with all temperatures within normal limits. Then they drained the Japanese fuel and refilled the system with American 150 performance number gasoline. Nakamura adjusted the fuel mixture and supercharger settings to take advantage of the higher octane rating, allowing more aggressive boost pressures without risking detonation. The results exceeded their most pessimistic projections. The same engine, with no physical modifications whatsoever, produced 18% more horsepower on American fuel. Climb rate would improve proportionally. Maximum speed would increase. High-altitude performance, where supercharger boost was critical, would improve even more dramatically. 18%, Nakamura repeated, his voice hollow. Our pilots are meeting American aircraft with an 18% power disadvantage before any other factors are considered. Watanabe had been running calculations on his slide rule. It is worse than that, he said. American engines are designed to take full advantage of this fuel from the beginning. Their superchargers, their compression ratios, their cooling systems are all optimized for this performance level. Our engine is simply not designed to utilize fuel this powerful. Their purpose-built engines likely produce even greater advantages. Yamamoto sat heavily on a laboratory stool. He was remembering a conversation from 3 years earlier with an Army Air Service general who had assured him that Japanese pilot spirit and training would overcome any material American advantages. Yamamoto had believed it then, or at least had wanted to believe it. Japanese pilots did receive extensive training. Japanese aircraft were designed with careful attention to maneuverability and pilot visibility. But no amount of training could give a pilot an additional 18% engine power. No amount of spirit could make an aircraft climb faster than its physics allowed. The American advantage was not soft or psychological. It was hard, material, and essentially insurmountable given Japan's industrial position. The team spent another week documenting their findings and preparing a formal report. During this time, Yamamoto wrestled with how to present the information. He knew that unwelcome news often resulted in consequences for the messenger. Several colleagues had seen their careers damaged after delivering reports that contradicted senior officers' expectations or suggested problems that could not be easily solved. But Yamamoto was also a man of integrity who believed that accurate information was essential for sound decision-making. Concealing or minimizing these findings would be a disservice to the pilots whose lives depended on realistic assessments of their capabilities relative to the enemy. He decided to present the findings factually, without editorial comment or recommendations. The data would speak for itself. The report was submitted through channels in December 1944. For 2 weeks, there was no response. Then Yamamoto received a summons to appear before a technical review committee in Tokyo. The committee room was austere, with a long table occupied by 6 senior officers and 2 civilian officials from the Ministry of Munitions. Yamamoto was directed to stand before them and present his findings verbally. He began by describing the testing methodology, emphasizing the rigor and repeatability of their procedures. He presented the chemical analysis results, the performance number measurements, and the operational test data showing the 18% power increase. He kept his voice neutral, his manner professional. When he finished, there was silence in the room. The senior officer at the center of the table, a general whose name Yamamoto did not know, spoke first. "You are telling us that American aircraft have a fundamental performance advantage that cannot be overcome through pilot skill or tactical innovation." Yamamoto chose his words carefully. "I am telling you what our tests measured, General. The interpretation and implications are beyond my expertise." Another officer leaned forward. "How do we know this fuel sample is representative? Perhaps this was special fuel used only for specific high-performance applications." Yamamoto had anticipated this question. We have cross-referenced our findings with captured documents and interrogation reports from American prisoners. The 150 performance number fuel, designated grade 100-130 by the Americans, appears to be their standard aviation gasoline supplied to all frontline fighter and bomber units. A civilian official spoke next. What would be required for Japanese industry to produce equivalent fuel? This was the question Yamamoto had dreaded. He took a breath before answering. We would require substantial supplies of raw petroleum with characteristics suitable for high-octane base stock production. We would need alkylation units, catalytic reforming facilities, and specialized chemical synthesis capabilities for aromatic blending agents. We would need platinum catalysts and tetraethyl lead in quantities we cannot currently obtain. The honest answer, with respect, is that we cannot produce this fuel with existing or foreseeable resources. The room fell silent again. Yamamoto could see the officials exchanging glances, their expressions unreadable. Finally, the general spoke again. This report will be classified at the highest level. You will discuss these findings with no one outside this room. You and your team will continue research into improving Japanese fuel formulations within the constraints of available resources. That will be all. Yamamoto bowed and withdrew. He was not disciplined or punished. The report simply vanished into the classified archives, where it could not disturb anyone's assumptions or require any institutional response. But the knowledge could not be unlearned. Yamamoto returned to Yokohama and gathered his team. He told them about the meeting, including the classification order and the instruction to continue their research. Nakamura laughed bitterly. Continue research with what goal? We cannot change the fundamental resource situation. Yamamoto nodded. No, but perhaps we can make marginal improvements. Perhaps we can find ways to extend engine life on lower-grade fuel. Perhaps we can help pilots understand how to maximize performance within real limitations. We do what we can. Watanabe had been quiet, but now he spoke. I have been thinking about what this means beyond just our work. If the fuel gap is this large, and if the Americans have been producing this fuel in vast quantities for years, then every aircraft encounter our pilots have fought has been against opponents with a fundamental power advantage. Every report claiming equality or superiority of Japanese aircraft design has been wrong. Our pilots have been brave, incredibly brave, to achieve what they have achieved under these conditions. But bravery cannot change the outcome when the material gap is this large. The three men sat in silence, contemplating this truth. Outside the laboratory windows, the winter sun was setting over Yokohama harbor, where ships sat idle for lack of fuel to move them. What the Japanese engineers had discovered was a manifestation of a much larger industrial reality that would determine the outcome of the Pacific conflict. American fuel production capacity in 1944 was over 300 million barrels, while Japan produced less than 30 million barrels and was rapidly losing access to even that amount as supply lines were disrupted. But quantity was only part of the story. American petroleum industry engineers had been working for more than a decade on high-octane fuel development, driven by competition among oil companies to supply increasingly powerful automobile engines. When military applications became priority, this commercial research translated immediately into combat advantage. Refineries across America were converted or built to produce 100-octane and higher fuel, with production reaching hundreds of thousands of barrels per day. Japan had no comparable petroleum industry infrastructure. Before the conflict, Japan imported most of its aviation gasoline from the United States itself. When that source was cut off, Japanese refineries struggled to produce enough fuel of any octane rating, let alone high-performance formulations. The fuel gap was one expression of a broader industrial disparity that touched every aspect of military capability. American factories produced aircraft at rates 5 to 10 times higher than Japanese plants. American training programs graduated pilots with hundreds of flight hours, while Japanese programs, lacking fuel for training, were forced to send pilots to combat with as little as 60 hours. American logistics systems kept forward bases supplied with ammunition, spare parts, and provisions, while Japanese units increasingly fought with shortages of everything. Dr. Yamamoto understood all of this intellectually. He had read reports and seen statistics. But there was something about holding that American fuel sample, about watching his own Japanese engine produce 18% more power on foreign gasoline, that made the abstract concrete. It was no longer numbers on a page. It was the tangible chemical reality of industrial supremacy. In the months following their fuel analysis, Yamamoto's team did continue their research as ordered. They experimented with blending agents that could be produced domestically. They tested fuel formulations, optimized for engine longevity rather than maximum power, recognizing that Japan needed to extend the life of its existing aircraft rather than hoping for performance parity. They developed guidelines for pilots on fuel mixture management to minimize consumption. These were marginal improvements, exactly as Yamamoto had predicted. They could not change the fundamental situation, but they could perhaps help some pilots survive a little longer. Nakamura, the naval aviation specialist, was transferred in February 1945 to a unit working on special attack aircraft. Before he left, he came to see Yamamoto one last time. "I keep thinking about those American pilots," Nakamura said. "They probably have no idea about any of this. They climb into their aircraft and their engines produce full power, and they do not think about why. They do not know that somewhere in Texas or California, a chemical engineer made their survival more likely and our pilot's survival less likely through the composition of a fuel blend. They just fly, and they have power when they need it, and that seems natural to them." Yamamoto nodded slowly. Perhaps that is the nature of such advantages. Those who possess them take them for granted as the natural order. Those who lack them understand their significance precisely because the lack is felt so keenly. Nakamura was quiet for a moment. "When this is over," he said finally, "I hope our country will remember that this kind of capacity, this industrial and scientific depth, is the true measure of national strength, not spirit, not will, not tradition. Those things matter, yes, but they cannot overcome material reality when the gap is too large." The two men shook hands. Nakamura left for his new assignment. Yamamoto never saw him again. Watanabe remained at the laboratory through the spring of 1945. He became increasingly withdrawn as the military situation deteriorated. In April, much of the surrounding area was damaged in air attacks, though the underground laboratory survived. One evening in early May, Watanabe came to Yamamoto with a request. He wanted to document everything they had learned about American fuel technology in a comprehensive technical paper, not for publication during the current conflict, but for preservation and future study. Yamamoto considered the request. It was potentially dangerous to create such a document, which could be seen as defeatist or as preparing for an outcome that official policy did not acknowledge. But he also saw the scientific value in preserving their findings. "Do it," he told Watanabe. "Be thorough and precise. If this work can help future engineers understand what we faced and why, then it will have value regardless of what happens to us." Watanabe spent 3 weeks writing the document, a detailed technical analysis of American high-octane fuel production methods, chemical compositions, and performance implications. He included all of their test data, their reverse engineering findings, and their assessments of the industrial requirements for producing equivalent fuel. The document was completed in late May 1945. Watanabe sealed it in a waterproof container and buried it in the hills above the laboratory. He told Yamamoto the location, but no one else. The conflict ended in August. Yamamoto's laboratory was occupied by American technical intelligence teams who were combing through Japanese research facilities to understand what progress Japanese scientists had made in various fields. Yamamoto cooperated fully with the American investigators. He showed them his fuel research, his test results, and his conclusions about the performance gap. The Americans were professionally interested, but not surprised. They knew what their fuel could do. They had designed it that way. One American officer, a petroleum engineer in civilian life, spent several hours discussing technical details with Yamamoto. Near the end of their conversation, the American asked a question that stayed with Yamamoto for the rest of his life. "When you first tested our fuel and saw the results," the American asked, "what did you think?" Yamamoto considered his answer carefully. I thought that we had been trying to win a contest where the outcome was determined before the first engagement. I thought that our pilots had been extraordinarily brave to achieve what they achieved while operating at such a disadvantage. I thought that industrial capacity is not a separate factor from military strength, but rather its foundation. The American nodded. He seemed to understand that Yamamoto was not just making a technical observation, but expressing something about the nature of modern industrial conflict itself. After the occupation authorities processed him, Yamamoto was allowed to return to civilian life. He joined a petroleum company that was rebuilding Japan's refinery capacity, this time for peaceful purposes. He spent the remaining decades of his career working on fuel efficiency and quality improvements. He never forgot the lessons of that Yokohama laboratory. When Japan's economy began its remarkable post-war growth, driven by manufacturing excellence and industrial capacity, Yamamoto saw it as validation of what he had learned during those difficult years. National strength came from the ability to produce and innovate at scale, to turn scientific knowledge into industrial reality, to build the infrastructure that could support sustained economic activity. Watanabe recovered his buried document after the conflict ended. The paper was eventually published in a Japanese engineering journal in 1952, where it became an important historical source for understanding the technical dimensions of the Pacific air confrontation. Watanabe became a professor of chemical engineering, training a new generation of scientists who would help build Japan's petrochemical industry. Nakamura did not survive the conflict. His name appears on memorial lists, another skilled engineer lost to the consequences of decisions made far above his level of authority. The story of the fuel gap remains one of the lesser-known aspects of the Pacific confrontation, overshadowed by more dramatic narratives of individual courage and tactical brilliance, but in many ways, it captures something essential about the nature of modern industrial-era military conflict. The American advantage in aviation fuel was not an accident or a lucky discovery. It was the product of a deep, broad, technologically sophisticated petroleum industry that had been developing for decades before the conflict began. It reflected vast capital investments, extensive engineering expertise, abundant natural resources, and industrial infrastructure that could translate laboratory discoveries into mass production. Japan, despite having many brilliant individual scientists and engineers, could not match this systemic capability. The fuel gap was a symbol of a larger industrial gap that manifested in aircraft production, ship construction, munitions supply, and logistics capacity. What makes the story of Yamamoto, Nakamura, and Watanabe significant is not the technical details of octane ratings and chemical formulations, though those details help us understand the magnitude of the disparity. What makes it significant is the human experience of confronting a truth that contradicted everything one had believed and hoped. These were not simple men easily discouraged by difficulties. They were highly trained scientists who had dedicated their careers to serving their country through technical excellence. They believed in the value of their work and the possibility of achieving great things through knowledge and effort. When they tested that American fuel and saw their engine produce 18% more power, they experienced a moment of clarity that was both intellectually illuminating and emotionally devastating. They understood, in a way that abstract statistics could never convey, that the contest they were engaged in had dimensions they had not fully appreciated. Their response to this understanding reveals their character. They did not deny the evidence or retreat into comforting illusions. They documented their findings honestly, presented them to authorities accurately, and continued working within realistic constraints to make whatever marginal contributions they could. This combination of clear-eyed realism and continued dedication to duty represents something admirable about the human capacity to face difficult truths without being destroyed by them. Yamamoto, Watanabe, and Nakamura could not change the industrial balance between Japan and America, but they could understand it clearly, document it carefully, and learn from it for the future. The legacy of their work extended beyond the immediate conflict. The post-war Japanese petroleum and chemical industries were built by engineers who understood, from direct wartime experience, the strategic importance of industrial capacity and technological capability. Japan's remarkable economic development in the second half of the 20th century was driven in part by this hard-won appreciation for the connection between scientific knowledge, industrial infrastructure, and national strength. In Yamamoto's later years, he occasionally gave talks to young engineers about his wartime experience. He always emphasized the same lesson: technical excellence is necessary, but not sufficient. Knowledge must be supported by the industrial capacity to apply it at scale. Individual brilliance must be embedded in systems that can translate ideas into production. He would sometimes tell the story of holding that sample of American aviation gasoline, of watching his Japanese engine transform its performance on that foreign fuel, of understanding in that moment something fundamental about the conflict and about industrial civilization itself. The fuel was clear with a blue tint, he would say. It looked like any other aviation gasoline. But the difference was not in appearance. The difference was in everything that had gone into making it. The oil fields and pipelines and refineries and chemical plants and research laboratories and engineering schools and capital markets that made it possible to produce that fuel in the quantities needed. That is what we were truly facing. Not just American aircraft, American industrial civilization. His audiences would listen quietly to these reflections from a man who had seen in a laboratory test the shape of the future that was coming. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.